Europa y la crisis, una crisis de Europa. Así reza el título de la serie de eventos que hoy inauguramos y que llevamos a cabo en colaboración con el ICREA, el Instituto Catalán de Recerca y Estudios Avanzados, el Departamento de Teoría y Sociología de la Universidad de Barcelona y el proyecto de investigación TRAMOD. Les doy cordialmente la bienvenida a nuestra sede del Goethe-Institut Barcelona. Herzlich willkommen heute hier im Goethe-Institut. No pasa un día sin que yo misma, o seguramente también la mayoría de ustedes, no nos planteemos de un modo u otro el problema de la crisis en Europa, ya sea desde las numerosas noticias y programas de los medios de comunicación o en el círculo de amigos, colegas y conocidos. Hablamos de la política del día, de opiniones y valoraciones, de causas, contradicciones y perspectivas. Muchas veces mal petrechados con un saber a medias y simples suposiciones. Y eso no solo por parte de los ciudadanos, pues también entre los políticos impera la inseguridad y el desconcierto. Estos toman decisiones a menudo en rápida sucesión y una y otra vez nos encontramos con que lo que hoy aún es correcto, mañana dejará de ser válido como solución de continuidad, pues no se han previsto o no se podían prever los efectos indirectos de algunas decisiones. También se habla una y otra vez del papel de Alemania en todo este proceso. Debe liderar más, debe contenerse más, debe ser más solidaria y pagar más, a pesar de estar haciendo ya una importante aportación financiera, o debe seguir manteniendo su actual posición, etc. Con nuestra serie de eventos queremos alejarnos del circuito de la política del día a día. Queremos contemplar o hacer contemplar las evoluciones europeas desde distintas perspectivas científicas a fin de comprender mejor muchos de los factores que la política no nos comunica o no puede comunicarnos, pero que resultan determinantes para el transcurso de la crisis. Se trata de obtener un conocimiento más profundo, nuevos puntos de vista e impulsos para la reflexión, pues el futuro de Europa. También es un proyecto de los ciudadanos de este continente. Le hemos solicitado al profesor Peter Wagner que aborde la concepción de esta serie temática y ha aceptado a pesar de numerosas obligaciones académicas. Gracias a su rica red de contactos con especialistas, ha podido ganar a renombrados expertos de distintos países para este proyecto. Para nuestra mesa redonda de hoy, Historia de Europa, lastre o ressource en la crisis actual, quisiera dar una calurosa bienvenida a nuestros invitados. Al profesor Johann Arnason, catedrático emérito de Sociología de la Universität Latrobe de Melbourne, y al profesor Gerard Delanty, catedrático de Sociología y de Pensamiento Político y Social en la Universidad de Sussex en Brighton. Estimado señor Arnason, estimado señor Delanty, nos alegramos mucho de que hayan aceptado hoy nuestra invitación. Seien Sie uns beide herzlich willkommen. Ich freue mich, dass Sie da sind. También quiero saludar muy cordialmente al Peter Wagner, el moderator de los 6 próximos debates. Herzlich willkommen, wir kennen uns inzwischen gut. Y gracias a todos por venir. Herzlich willkommen, dass Sie gekommen sind. Herzlichen Dank, dass Sie gekommen sind. Y ahora paso el palabra al Peter Wagner. Gracias.
I would like to thank indeed Marion Hase and the Goethe-Institut for having made this event today and this whole series of debates possible, and for the kind introduction today. We will start this series of discussions about Europe and the crisis and the possible crisis of Europe that this entails with a look at European history. And I just want to, I don't want to preempt too much of what our 2 main speakers will be saying, but I just want to suggest to you that there have been 2 main ways of looking at the history of Europe from a point of view of the present. There has been one way of looking at this as a smooth, long-term, but largely linear progress, which starts maybe with the Renaissance, proceeds through the Enlightenment, then leads to democratic societies and market societies, which then, in the later 20th century, increasingly produce wealth and at the same time peaceful coexistence. But there has also been the other way of looking at European history, namely as marked by conflicts and violence. Such a history could start with the religious wars, would move through colonialism, intra-European warfare from the late 19th century onwards, class domination and class struggle, and leading to totalitarianisms in the middle of the 20th century. Now, it seems to me that none of these narratives of European history is entirely true. Certainly they cannot both be true, but probably none of them is entirely true. But one of the problems of our times is that over the past half-century of European integration, we have for a long time forgotten that there is ambivalence, openness, need to think about and talk about various aspects of European history, indeed to understand the present. We have tended to overemphasize the first positive, optimistic kind of account. Recently, we could say, awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize for European integration for the EU, for the process of European integration, and we have tended to neglect the darker sides of European history, and this indeed may disable us to understand the current troubles and crises in which Europe finds itself in, way beyond what we read in today's newspapers about financial and economic aspects. And we aim to explore in this first discussion some of the aspects of European history which may indeed be necessary to be looked at again and anew to understand the current situation. Marion Hase has already introduced our 2 speakers for tonight, and I would just like to add that both Johann Arnason and Gerard Delanty are social theorists and historical sociologists, and I will not emphasize the academic disciplines which are not so relevant for our discussion tonight, but rather to say that they both understand social theory as an effort to think about the concepts that we also use in everyday public and political debates as tools that we need to understand our current situation. And they are historical sociologists because they are convinced that we need to understand the history of our societies to be able to grasp the main issues of the present. With this, and without further ado, I will give the word to Johann Arnason to start tonight's discussion.
Thank you. How do I?
No, I think it's fine.
No? Okay, thanks very much for the invitation, and to my friend and colleague Peter Wagner for the introduction. I shall say nothing about the future and next to nothing about the present. It's all about the past. I think it may be useful if you want to know where you are going and to have some idea of where you are coming from. And if you want a brief answer to the question in the title, burden or resource, then European history is both. It's a burden. History destroys. History can lead to irreparable losses. And even when it creates, it can create problems. problems have a way of coming back to haunt you, of resurfacing when you think they have been solved. So a burden, yes, but also a resource. For one thing, and contrary to what some major authorities have argued, people can and sometimes do learn from history. And one thing you can learn from it is to apply comparative perspectives to a question like that of European integration. European history tells us that integration has a long history, takes many forms, and also that there is no pre-established harmony between the various integrative mechanisms. I shall come back to that. So take this as a kind of reflection on the topic when, where, and what was Europe. Because if you talk about European integration, you are assuming the pre-existence of some kind of historical entity or formation that can be brought to a higher level of integration. The first thing, it may be a commonplace, but it bears repeating. The first thing to say is that there are no natural borders of Europe. I mean, it's not a geographical given. It's a commonplace, certainly, that the eastern border is not natural, and the Ural is not a border between Europe and Asia. And if you ask the much debated question, does Russia belong to Europe? I think the only possible answer is yes and no, sometimes more and sometimes less, depending on the periods of history you're looking at. What about the south? Is the Mediterranean a natural border? I don't think so. I mean, we are familiar with it as a divide between two worlds, but it's not always been like that. There was a time when there was close economic, political, cultural integration all around the Mediterranean. I'm, of course, talking about the Roman Empire. Not even the Atlantic is a natural border, because at least one possible idea of Europe, one that is very present in the debate today, is that it is a cultural complex, including the offshoots that have developed in European settler societies across the Atlantic. In the north, there are no natural borders there. Europe, certainly in the course of its history, has acquired more and more distant northern borders. So we have to think of it as a historical formation. And if you start reflecting on that question, obviously you have to begin by asking, when did Europe begin? Where can you at least approximately date the emergence of Europe? Now, I've looked a bit at the literature on this issue because it's related to things I've been working on. I think I've come across 10 different answers to the question of the beginnings of Europe. I won't go through them all now, but let me just mention the earliest one. One of my Czech colleagues is just publishing a book which is called The Emergence of Europe. And he makes the story begin with a transition from Mesolithic to Neolithic cultures, something like 8,000 years ago. There is archaeological evidence for this view. It's one that you have to take seriously. It's maybe not my preferred approach, but you have to reckon with it. The last dating, I think, is the turn of the end of the Middle Ages, 15th century or so, when the idea of Europe begins to gain ground as against the idea of Christendom. Won't go further into that now, but the point is, I think we have to live with and take seriously very different ideas of the chronological borders of Europe. And if that is so, it may get us one step further to at the point that these answers are not always relating to the same question. And if you think in terms of a distinct trajectory, a chain of events, then it may well make sense to go back to prehistoric times. If you're rather thinking in terms of a genealogy of cultural sources, then of course there is the case very often made for ancient Greece, most forcefully recently by Christian Mayer in a book called Kulturum der Freiheitswillen. Of course, once you are into ancient Greece, you have more choices. And do you make the story begin with Homer or with classical Athens? But if you think in terms of what I call the historical formation, cultural area or complex, roughly corresponding to the geographical unit that we are used to call Europe, then I think we have to come down on the side of the Middle Ages. I mean, Europe as a historical region, let's call it a historical macro region to distinguish it from the smaller regions inside it. Europe as a historical macro region is a creation of the Middle Ages. And when I say Middle Ages, I mean a long-term process, roughly a millennium, from the fragmentation of the Western Roman world in the 5th and 6th century to the brink of the Reformation in the 15th century. This is the period, to mention only the major landmarks, the period during which the idea of the Roman Empire is reincarnated, not re-established in the same way or on the same scale as before, but certainly in a way that made it a crucial institution for medieval Western Europe. This is also the time of what the medievalist Robert Bartlett calls the making of Europe, in a book that has become a bit of a contemporary classic, and he is talking about the great expansion of Western Christendom during the High Middle Ages. What I'd like to add to this is that, to my mind, the way of looking at this that makes most sense is to see two Europes in the making. I mean the Western Christian and the Byzantine one. Because there is the cultural and religious expansion of Byzantium north and northeast. There is its all-round influence on Western Christendom. And to call it another Europe in the making seems justified because of the very close interaction and the all-round impact on the Western one. So, two Europes in the making, interconnected, in competition for certain key geographical areas, in conflict, in the end very asymmetrical one, because Byzantine Europe was a loser in the conflict with Western Christendom. One of the fatal blows to the Byzantine world was the sacking of Constantinople by the Crusaders in 1204. But it didn't disappear altogether. the Byzantine legacy of the other Europe is a factor that we still have to reckon with, and that has come back in sometimes surprising ways in recent times. Well, what do we call this Europe that was created during the Middle Ages? I have used the terms historical formation, historical macro region. Do we call it a civilization? Because, as you will know, references to European civilization as possessing some kind of unity and continuity are quite frequent in the literature. Books with titles like European Civilization in Comparative Perspectives are easy to find. Well, what do we mean by a civilization? I'm not going to get into a discussion of that now, but very briefly, the people who use this term in discussions of social theory and comparative history usually have in mind the intertwining of two things, ways of experiencing and understanding the world, worldviews in a very broad sense on one side, and institutional complexes, frameworks of social life corresponding to these understandings of the world on the other. Well, if that is the case, then I think you can argue that Western Christendom, medieval Western Christendom, was very much a civilization, one of the key examples in history. And since I made references to integration, let me just make a brief aside on that. One of the very interesting features of the history of medieval Western Christendom is the conflict between two integrative institutions, the papacy and the empire. This is the phenomenon that one German historian describes as the Urform der Gewaltenteilung, but it's many other things besides, and among other things, conflict between two key integrative institutions that led to the creation of a kind of public sphere as one arena where they fought out their rivalry. But do we see this medieval Western Christendom as synonymous with or as an episode in the history of European civilization? This is where I have doubts, because for one thing, as I was arguing, there were those two civilizations present, Western Christendom and Byzantine, and two Europes in the making. The actual outcome is a combination, however asymmetrical. There's a further argument against simply equating Western Christendom with European civilization. It's an argument rather popular today and needs to be taken seriously, although I think we also need to see it in proper perspective. It is the presence of Judaism and Islam in the making of medieval Europe. Western Europe, they certainly are both there, but there is today, if I may say so, a certain tendency to overstate the case and over-romanticize the phenomenon as if it had been a kind of multiculturalism avant la lettre. It was not. The presence of Islam in the history of Western Christendom is important, but it has to do with an often intricate combination of different things. It is a demarcating factor. It is an embodiment of otherness against which Western Christendom defines itself. It is a transmitter of cultural resources and traditions, including the rediscovery of the ancient world. It is a source of techniques models of various kinds as a more advanced civilization in many ways. It's one from which Western Christendom can learn. Briefly on the question of Judaism, I think to understand the role of Judaism in the medieval world, including medieval Western Christendom, the best key concept is the one proposed by Shmuel Eisenstadt. This was a diasporic civilization. A diasporic civilization is defined by, firstly, the lack of territorial continuity, and secondly, by the fact that it does not possess independent political power, or at least didn't most of the time we are talking. How much more time have I got?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. But be that as it may, I mean, this multidimensionality of medieval history is an argument against simply equating it with the emergence and maturing of one civilization. And then there is one more, and I think very decisive argument against the assumption of a continuity of European civilization. And here I will briefly go back to what I think are the very insightful works of Shmuel Eisenstadt again, and that's where you find, although in sometimes unsatisfactory versions, a defense of the idea of modernity as a new civilization. One that emerges, or at least emerges more momentously in Western Europe, in the Western Christian world than elsewhere. And in that particular area, it coincides with the most significant religious schism of all times. I mean the schism of the two Reformations, sometimes described as a Reformation and a Counter-Reformation. The world we know as, the world we call modern, I mean the one that has been developing since the 16th century, a long 16th century, is very much a product of the shall we say, the encounter of these two great transformations. A civilizational mutation, producing modernity as a new civilization, characterized by an unprecedented emphasis on human autonomy in various senses and various guises. Its effect magnified by this uniquely important religious schism. Well, looking at, again, at the background to European integration, and we should allow for the fact that it has this multi-civilizational history behind it, that there is also a long record of the specific integrative mechanisms and institutions of those civilizations. But since I haven't got much time, I will now do a bit of a jump and move on to a more short-term background. One of the very important features of the European version of the new civilization we called modernity was a multi-imperial character. I think this is in comparative historical perspective. This is the multi-imperial civilization par excellence. Elsewhere you have either characteristically mono-imperial ones like the Byzantine and the Chinese, or you have one with such a geographical extension that imperial formations take shape in relative isolation from each other, like those that divided the Islamic world in the 16th century. Multi-imperial, in the more precise sense that you have a coexistence of rival imperial centers in a relatively limited space. But with a transoceanic reach on the one side and transcontinental on the other. And this is the constellation that exploded into global military conflict in the summer of 1914. That is the event sometimes characterized as the beginning of the near self-destruction of European civilization. And I want to stress this point because there is a sort of conventional wisdom about the First World War and about everything that followed, that it was primarily a matter of unmanageable conflicts between nation states. And I think that's misleading. The First World War is not primarily about destructive rivalry of nation states, nor is the Versailles system restoration of the hegemony of the nation state. It should all rather be seen in the context of inter-imperial rivalry and that taking new forms after the First World War. The second round one then was the Second World War, and now to round this off for good, I think this perspective on the past helps to understand a very important work about European integration. I'm thinking about a book by Alan Milward, The European Rescue of the Nation State. It seems to me indeed the case that European integration, or rather the new form of European integration that you see after World War II, is about rescuing the nation state that had almost disappeared from the scene during the short-lived imperial unification of Europe under Nazi rule. And that applies to roughly the first quarter of a century of the process. After that, since sometime in the 1970s, you have something that's probably better described as a process of state formation of a new kind and at a new level. But do we call it an empire, or is it helpful at all to compare it, as many authors have done, with earlier imperial institutions in European history, like, say, the Holy Roman one? I think it's fitting to end on a question, and so I won't say anything more now. I have overstepped my time a bit, but we can come back to this in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Johann. And I give immediately the word to Gerard Delanty.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to take up from where Johann pretty much stopped the post-Second World War project of European integration, and to offer some perspectives on that in view of the current crisis. And the argument that I essentially want to put to you is that the situation in which we are in viewed in the perspective of European history in the past half century, since 1945, or wherever you want to begin it, it's really one about the relationship between capitalism and democracy, and that's really what I want to talk about today. I want to argue that what we're witnessing today, all the more clearly today, is a changed relationship between capitalism and democracy, a changed relationship between the state and the economy. And that possibly signals a reconfiguration of what we can call the societal pact or the so-called post-Second World War consensus that emerged in the decades following the Second World War, with the consolidation of what we can call a model of European capitalism, a model of social capitalism that on the whole was, with compromises to be sure, acceptable to the right and left, at least the centre-right and centre-left. And I think what's unfolding now, and it's been unfolding for some time, is precisely that consensus. And it's not going to be put together very easily, and I think it's an illusion to think that one can go back to the societal arrangement that was worked out in those decades. And I would say, secondly, too, that the neoliberal approach is not the solution, and some will think that it's part of the problem. In any case, the Second World War project of European integration was an elite-led project, and it came from an era of social planning when there was widespread acceptance of, well, the projects of elites that were broadly taken on to varying degrees by the masses or unquestioned. It was very much a patrician, elite-led project, and that's sort of disintegrated today, with a changed relationship between elites and masses. The current situation, too, in the past number of years, since 2008, or where you take the crisis to begin in Europe, perhaps a year later, is a reminder of what several theorists, most notably David Harvey, but also Karl Marx, Maynard Keynes, Schumpeter, have described as the crisis-ridden nature of capitalism. And I would make the argument that maybe it is the case that crisis is the normal condition of capitalism, and that therefore what we're witnessing today is precisely the normal condition of capitalism, and the decades of relative stability that followed the Second World War were perhaps not quite so normal. Financial crises are not unique, as Charles Kindleberg in his history of economic crises has pointed out. So there's, in a way, a certain normality today. Certainly if we take the longer perspective of the 20th century, going back as far as the end of the 19th century, when the modern industrial economy took off, it would be, in my view, hard to draw the conclusion that capitalist accumulation leads to peace and prosperity. I mean, consider the three wars that took place in Europe in this period, and which were in the living memory of the founders of the European Union, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, the First and Second World Wars, and what is often very conveniently forgotten, the numerous colonial wars that the European states, in particular Britain and France, fought to retain the overseas colonies, right up until the early 1960s, the Algerian War, earlier the French and British war with Egypt. So all of these colonial wars, when the European powers sought to retain the overseas colonies, and three major economic crises in 1871 and 1929, and the current one. So I think a slightly broader perspective. The perspective I'm giving here is a sort of a shorter one than the longer term historical picture that Johann Arnason painted. But just in that period, we can perhaps get a certain, we can relativize the current situation. Now, I would also argue that what Europe, to take a more normative, critical position, what Europe needs to do is to become, I say, more European. what I mean by that, when I say that Europe needs to become more European, it needs to rediscover a part of its civilizational legacy that define modernity in important ways. And I think to try to identify the core of that element of European modernity, which has, I would argue, a civilizational underpinning, is in a social as opposed to either a market or a state-based conception of society. So I would argue that one of the features of European modernity and which it exported to the rest of the world is this idea of society as being social as opposed to being essentially market or state-based. And I think that is really what is different about Europe, and I would argue that that tradition needs to be recovered today. So to speak of Europe becoming more European is to assert the defense of the social against the market. But that will require a new vision of the social and the kind of economy that is desirable. To expand a little on that point I've just made, if there's a core of European value, it has been the assertion of social justice. That expressed itself in many different ways. And one of the ways that it has expressed itself is in the formation of a European societal model. That is a conception of society that's based on the values of solidarity and the pursuit of social justice. And I think that has been, to follow an argument that has been very nicely developed by Klaus Offer, that has underpinned a particular model of European capitalism. That is the prominence of state-defined and state-protected status categories, which set limits to the rule of markets and of voluntary transactions. Now, viewed in a global perspective, it's, in my view, therefore possible to speak of a European model of social capitalism that underpins the obvious diversity of different forms of capitalism, and too, I would include in that the British model, which is far closer to the European than the North American. Now, from the perspective of a conception of European modernity, such a conception of capitalism suggests that the form that modernity has taken has been in a certain tension between state, economy, and society, where capitalism has always been constrained. And Johann Arnason mentioned earlier the medieval struggle between the papacy and the empire, and a feature of this is that the battle was never entirely won. One side always set limits to what the other could do, and I think that's been a feature of European, in this case, I might say European civilization, that has been reflected in the form that capitalism has taken. So the outcome, to cut a long story very, very short, to make the point I want to make, is that the outcome has been a certain balance between capitalism and democracy. And this has been variously reflected in the nation-states of modern Europe, and it's a structural feature of Europe, as Karl Polanyi also recognized with the argument that a certain consensus was worked out between European socialism and conservatism. A whole range of other thinkers, the British writer T.H. Marshall, in his famous account of citizenship in 1949, argued that modern social citizenship reflected in part this view of democratic citizenship as a counterbalance to the inequalities of capitalism. Now, it's, of course, the case that this perspective was limited by a sense of class struggles, seen as you did the social contract as an achievement of the state and not as, I think it really was, the negotiated outcomes of political mobilization spearheaded by civil society organizations, trade unions, labor movements, various social democratic parties. Now, in many ways, what we're seeing today is not necessarily a crisis of capitalism or a crisis of the economy. I certainly think that that's there, but a crisis of the state. and which has signs of becoming a societal crisis. Now, capitalism is legitimated by the state through the medium of law. The demands on the state, therefore, are far greater at times of economic upheaval. And it's apparent since 2008 or 9 that the state has not succeeded in balancing the dual functions of the state between, that is, crisis management with democracy, or, if you want, efficiency with legitimacy. Now, I would add as an extended footnote to that, what has changed is not only the objective context, the objectivity of a financial crisis, for such there is, but also the subjective dimension to that, namely the increased demands for legitimation and probably unsustainable expectations of wealth creation that's developed over the past decades, when it was still possible to believe in the post-Second World War consensus. Well, it was still possible to believe in it because of the measures that temporarily worked, the sort of neoliberal measures that temporarily, I emphasize, worked, but once these stopped working, the illusion has evaporated. So the roots of the crisis in the expansion and transformation, the roots of the present crisis lie in the expansion and transformation of neoliberalism into a globally networked capitalism in the 1990s. Now, the nation-state in this situation is no longer the container of the components of capitalism, the components of production, of markets, of finance. Since the Single European Act and too with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, the liberal agenda crept increasingly into the project of European integration with market deregulation and financial liberalization, and the 4 elements that define the European integration project, namely the free movement of capital, labor, goods and services, in a way epitomizes the neoliberal agenda. I'm not saying the European project was in its conception neoliberal, that certainly wasn't the case, but these elements of it did lend themselves to, we can all see all the more clearly today, to the neoliberal agenda, and the introduction of the single currency was part of this process that led to what was, well, an interconnected capitalist economy in Europe. But we can see that this interconnected economy is now a fragmented one, in that it's based on, it led to different modes of capitalist accumulation, most notably between the core economies in the north, with Germany obviously at the forefront, and the southern Mediterranean countries. I think it's very interesting to consider how changed the situation is today than it was, say, 10 years ago, when there was considerable debate as to whether the European Union could bear the incorporation of the Central and Eastern European countries. It was widely believed that it didn't have a capacity to do it. The same was said, of course, about the unification of Germany, its capacity to integrate East Germany, and but the example of Poland, in my view, illustrates very well this reversal in destinies. The Polish economy has not, if I've not misread the signs, from the problems that have beset, well, this country, Italy, Portugal, Greece, Ireland, the southern European countries. Of course, it wasn't also too long ago, I was a postgraduate student, when it was widely debated whether these countries, in particular those that had emerged out of dictatorships, Portugal, Greece, Spain, whether they could be democratized, and the problems which were much discussed in the 1980s. And of course, in the longer perspective now, we can see that that certain problems, unanticipated problems, were present in the design, entirely unanticipated problems that have returned. But it just simply illustrates the how quickly things, due to various crises can change. The integration of Eastern Europe has been relatively successful, whereas it seems that the incorporation of Southern European countries into the Eurozone is a much more formidable task. In any case, the project of European integration has been, in its economic aims, I would like to argue, focused mostly on market integration, but the nature of the capitalist economy is that it's also based on production and on finance, which obviously makes possible production through the supply of credit, without which the necessary investment and liquidity is impossible. So production, market and finance are the pillars, as it were, of capitalism. Now, on the production side, there are major differences between the economies of Europe in terms of industrial and post-industrial modes of production, as well as the remnants of pre-industrial artisan-based economies in parts of the South. Since the global credit boom, which most countries in Western Europe participated in and benefited from, the structural imbalances were not actually really critical. And most countries did experience economic growth. The Celtic tiger economy of Ireland being a dramatic example of boom and bust economies. The financial integration of Europe through the liberalisation of capital, which is really what European integration in the end made possible, at first seemed to complement wider market integration. But due to the different logics of production, market and finance, what proved critical with the different logics of these components of capitalism proved critical, especially once the global financial crisis impacted on European countries. So the picture I'm painting is that up until a certain point, 2008 to 2009, the logics of production, market and finance were somehow manageable, containable, and within the parameters of the nation state and of the European Union, but these have gone in different directions, and that was already underway long before the financial crisis, of course, began. The crisis in Europe is not only an economic one, but it's a political one, and increasingly it is a social one. So to speak of crisis here, one it's not just only as financial, but economic, but in addition political and social. Though the full scale of the social crisis has yet to be seen, perhaps with the exception of Greece, where I think it's quite in evidence. This can be characterized as a crisis in the model of democratic capitalism that seemed to have worked for several decades, and which was the basis of European integration since the early years of European integration. But what we're witnessing today is my argument is that capitalism and democracy are becoming uncoupled. The relationship between both was never, I'm not saying there was once a natural connection between them. I certainly don't say that, but somehow in the course of the post-Second World War decades, capitalism and democracy accommodated each other. Clearly they're both in tension with each other. Capitalism produces inequality. Democracy seeks to provide, amongst other things, egalitarianism. So both are prone to conflict, but they can be reconciled. The question is how, for there's no going back to the post-Second World War consensus, which rested on industrial economies based largely on male wage labor, on growth. Capitalism in Europe slowly accommodated itself to democracy, following demands for the inclusion and removal of injustice. And in the post-1945 period, this led to a more social kind of capitalism, returning to this point I made earlier, than definitely was previously the case. And in Germany, this has been referred to as the social market economy, or Rhenish capitalism, characterized by state coordination of the market, perhaps one of the best examples of what I would argue is a European trend. This was the era of the New Deal in the United States, the era of Keynesian economics, that the project of European integration was started. It was a project of elites, of patrician elites, who too were inspired by notions of social Catholicism and social liberalism. The social aims, of course, it's true that the social aims, let alone democratization of European, let's call it the European Union, were certainly marginal to its wider objectives, which were market integration. That is, once the goal of achieving lasting peace between Germany and France was reached. And indeed, one of the problems with the European Union is that it did achieve many of its aims. And once those aims are achieved, then the question becomes what other aims should it aspire to. But that fundamental aim of bringing about peace between Germany and France was successful. So the wider aim of market integration could then come into focus, and to an extent that has been pretty much realized. This was a time of relative worldwide economic growth. Capitalism, which I said is which then was largely industrial capitalism based on male wage labor, was not really under threat from the demands that have now come to the fore. It required simply modest egalitarianism and representation. It was a period before the consolidation of more radical cultural politics from multiculturalism, feminism, environmentalism. So the demands for democracy could easily be accommodated through the politics of class compromise, by trade unionism, by social democracy, the paternalistic neo-corporatist welfare state. It was, I said, an elite-driven project, particularly in its relation with the masses, and underpinned by the feasibility of the whole thing, the feasibility of organized industrial economies based on full employment. Now, from the 1970s, this changed, along with the social and economic foundations in industrial society and the comfortable illusion of an era of democratic capitalism came to an end slowly. In a sort of way, neoliberalism was a kind of a way of delaying the inevitable. The recent wave of protest movements can be seen as the continuation of the earlier phase of anti-capitalist protest under the changed circumstances of the present. In part, democratic capitalism, the basis of the post-1945 consensus, survived in the 1980s. Due to various measures, crisis management measures, the arrival of seemingly unlimited credit in the 1990s gave a kind of a lifeline that seemed to work until the whole house of cards eventually collapsed. Much of this represented to the supposedly positive side of globalization that came with the internet, and for those who believed in it, the third way was a way to keep alive the spirit of democratic capitalism, though in a social reality that was now essentially neoliberal. But today we're living in the aftermath of this period, which has shed its illusions about the domestication of capitalism and the promises of European integration, and to the promises of globalization. the separation, functional separation of the state and economy has become blurred as the state loses its ability to crisis manage, or at least loses the ability to appear to crisis manage. So on the one side, there are new demands for democracy, much more radical demands for democracy leveled against not only the European Union and its so-called misunderstood and exaggerated democratic deficit, but also against the national state. And on the other side, capitalism has generated a range of problems that neither the national state nor the European Union can solve in a way that apparently it was able to solve earlier problems, or at least postpone the perverse effects of both the problems and the attempts to solve them. So the current situation, I think, taking this broader perspective of it, not just looking at the way things are now, but to look at it in the context of the past 4 to 5 decades, is marked by the decoupling, the separation of capitalism and democracy, and the return of the latter with a repoliticization of questions of the economy, to which are now added the very, very rationale of European integration. Now, one should not conclude that the target of the democratic critique is only the European Union and global capitalism, but also the national state, which is also under pressure, since demands for legitimation are directed at all political elites. So the economic and political challenges of the present day are very different from those in the 1970s, due to much more extensive demands for democratic legitimation. As national states rely on democratic legitimation to a far greater extent than the EU, such demands will have greater impact on national governments. So retreating back to nation states is not really going to solve the problems, though to be sure, national governments have more means, more instruments at their disposal to accommodate such demands. Now, the economic crisis may be a political catalyst for a new wave of democratic politics, which so far is unorganized and lacking clear focus. The EU has been one target, though not the cause of the crisis, but certainly not seen as part of the solution. Its primary legitimacy, as is well documented now, derives from its efficiency. So long as it delivers the goods, people are happy with it and believe in it as value. But once it fails to be efficient, people withdraw, at least they withdraw active support. However, due to the escalation in demands for democracy, what I would call the rebellion of the masses against the elites, the EU is now being measured by ever higher standards, which it can never quite fulfill. The question now is whether the current crisis, the current 2008 crisis, will produce such a social and political transformation, leading to a new normative idea of the social. In terms of intermediate strategies, despite the undermining of the state in this era of global networked capitalism, there are some grounds for optimism in that one of the lessons learned since 2008 has been that the state indeed has a capacity to assert itself over the economy, as demonstrated by these numerous bailouts and new regulations imposed on the banking sector, where these have been imposed by states. And Iceland, I perhaps should not talk about Iceland, but I can comment that Iceland appears to have dragged itself out of its dire situation. I think Johann possibly has a slightly different perspective on that and has created a new draft constitution. No doubt you will say one that's going to be thrown away. But the general picture I would want to paint here is one of the resilience of the state, of the national state. But it's not going to solve these problems on its own. It would probably take an alliance with the European left to bring about effective change, which has an essential part, the European left, to play in the defence of democracy against the market. So I want to go back in conclusion to assert the importance of taking to this normative critical perspective of a social as opposed to a market-based conception of society, which is really the challenge today. And to achieve this, I've made the argument that Europe needs to become more European. It needs to. We need to look back into European history over the past centuries to see what is the defining core of Europe. And I say in conclusion, reiterate that it is in a social as opposed to a market or a state conception of society. And that is what needs to be recovered, but I don't think it can be recovered in the form of the kind of illusion of the era democratic capitalism that was the basis of the post-Second World War European project. The European project needs to be defined by new goals. For, as I said, it has already achieved many of its goals, its most important ones, and now it needs to set new goals. And I would argue against the illusion of going back to something that existed in a relatively brief period of time. And we're doing this in the context of a seemingly unfettered kind of capitalism, a crisis-ridden capitalism, which seems to be the normal condition of capitalism. So the question is, how can society be reasserted against capitalism? Thank you very much.